The wind howled through the trees outside my grandfather's old house, a low, mournful wail that matched the ache in my chest, but it was nothing compared to the fury boiling inside me when I caught Ruth trying to break in. I stood in the driveway, my breath fogging in the icy Denver night, watching as she screamed at the cops, her wrists cuffed, her designer coat torn at the sleeve. "This is my father's house," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation, her blonde hair wild in the wind. The officer turned to me, his flashlight cutting through the dark. "You know her?" he asked, his tone flat. "Unfortunately," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through me. She'd lost everything, money, pride, freedom, and still she came back, clawing for what wasn't hers. I pulled out my phone, showed him the deed with my name on it, and watched as they shoved her into the patrol car. Her eyes locked on mine, wide with fear, and for the first time I saw her break. But even then, I knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. My name's Ethan Caldwell, 28, a mechanic with calloused hands and a quiet life I thought I'd keep forever. I've got short brown hair, a scruffy beard, and a habit of keeping my head down. Until now. My grandfather, Henry Caldwell, was my rock, a wiry old man with sharp blue eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. He raised me after my mom died, and my dad buried himself in work, teaching me how to fix engines and save pennies. We'd spend summers in his creaky wooden house on the edge of Denver, surrounded by pines and secrets I didn't know he kept. He wasn't rich, not in the flashy way, but he was smart, saved every dime, invested in things he believed in, and promised me, "When I'm gone, you'll be taken care of." 6 months ago, cancer took him, slow and cruel, and I was the one holding his hand when he slipped away. I thought I'd grieve in peace, but Ruth, my aunt, had other plans. It started at his funeral, a gray December day in a cramped chapel smelling of lilies and damp wool. I stood by his casket, my hands clenched into fists, trying to focus on the man he'd been, his stories, his stubborn love, instead of the hollow pit in my gut. Then Ruth sauntered up, her heels clicking on the stone floor, her black dress screaming money she hadn't earned. She leaned in close, her perfume sharp and cloying, and whispered, "I already emptied his safe deposit box. There's nothing left for you." Her smirk twisted something inside me, a hot spike of rage I barely held back. She walked off, hips swaying like she'd just hit the jackpot, leaving me frozen, my blood pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to grab her by that fancy coat and shake the truth out of her, but I couldn't move. Henry had worked his whole life for what he had, and she'd barely visited him, only showing up when she smelled cash. Now she thought she'd won. The reception was a blur, murmured condolences, lukewarm coffee. But I stayed behind, staring at the casket, my jaw tight. That's when Mr. Callahan, Henry's lawyer, approached. He was old, stooped, with gray hair and a calm that felt like he knew more than he let on. "She took the wrong box," he said, his voice low, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I blinked, my head snapping up. "What?" He handed me a small envelope, his fingers steady. "Your grandfather knew her game. He had 2 safe deposit boxes. One was a decoy. She got the fake." My heart thudded, a slow grin creeping across my face as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a key and a note. "Trust details at First National. Ruth gets nothing." Callahan nodded. "The real one's yours. She's in for a hell of a surprise." I clutched the key, a mix of relief and glee bubbling up, but beneath it, a gnawing unease. She wouldn't let this go quietly. A few days later, I was back at Henry's house, my house now, sorting through his things, the air thick with dust and memory. The place was a time capsule, faded plaid curtains hanging limp over the windows, a wood stove squatting in the corner with its blackened pipe snaking up the wall, shelves crammed with books yellowed at the edges, and old tools rusted from years of neglect. I stood in the living room, my boots scuffing the worn hardwood, boxing up photos of Henry, him grinning with a fishing pole, him tinkering in the garage, him hugging me at my high school graduation. Each picture stung, a sharp jab of grief beneath my ribs, but I kept moving, needing to feel him close even as I packed him away. The phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me from the quiet, and I fished it out, my hands smudged with dust. It was Tommy, Ruth's son, a lanky 25-year-old with a gambler's twitch and a voice tight with nerves. "Mom's losing it," he said, the words spilling out fast. "She went to the bank today. Those stocks and bonds? Worthless. She's screaming you set her up." I almost laughed, a dry, bitter sound bubbling up as I pictured her in some sleek bank lobby, her face red, veins bulging, tellers shrugging helplessly behind the counter. "She set herself up," I said, my tone sharp, cutting through the line. Tommy sighed, a shaky exhale crackling in my ear. "Yeah, well, she's blaming you. Watch your back." I hung up, my stomach twisting into a knot. Tommy wasn't bad, just weak, always chasing Ruth's approval like a dog after scraps. But his warning stuck, a cold weight settling in my chest. I set the phone down on the coffee table, its scratched wood catching the dim light from a single lamp. The house creaked around me, the wind outside rattling the panes, and I rubbed my hands over my face trying to shake the unease. Ruth's smirk at the funeral flashed in my mind, those smug lips, that glint in her eyes, and I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. She'd thought she'd won, thought she'd stripped Henry bare before the dirt even settled over him. But Henry had outplayed her, and the satisfaction of that burned bright, though it didn't erase the dread creeping up my spine. I moved to the kitchen, needing coffee, something to steady me, when the doorbell rang, a harsh chime slicing through the stillness. My heart jumped, and I froze, the pot half filled in my hand. Who the hell was here? I set it down, wiping my hands on my jeans, and peered through the peephole. Lydia Pierce stood on the porch, her dark hair pulled back tight, her coat dusted with snowflakes that melted under the flickering porch light. I opened the door, my brow furrowing. "Lydia? What are you doing here?" She stepped inside without asking, her boots leaving wet prints on the floor, her eyes scanning the room like she was cataloging every shadow. "I told you I'd help," she said, her voice clipped, precise, the way it always got when she was nervous. "Those trust papers. I've got questions." I shut the door, the cold air clinging to me, and gestured to the table. "Coffee?" I offered, but she shook her head, already pulling her laptop from her bag. "No time. Sit." I obeyed, more out of habit than anything. She'd always had that command about her, even back when we dated. She opened the envelope Callahan gave me, spreading the papers out, her fingers quick and sure. "This land," she said, tapping a deed, "it's not just valuable, it's a gold mine. Zoned for commercial now. Millions, Ethan." My jaw dropped, a rush of awe for Henry flooding me, but her next words chilled it. "Ruth finds out, she'll do worse than brag." I swallowed, my throat dry. "She already threatened me," I said, pulling the note from my pocket. "Give it back, or die." Lydia's eyes widened, her hand pausing midair. "Jesus, we need more than a lawyer." That's when I called Mara Quinn. Lydia dialed her from my phone, pacing as she spoke. "Mara, it's Pierce. Got a job. Greedy aunt, threats, big money. You in?" I didn't hear the reply, but Lydia nodded, hanging up. "She'll be here tomorrow." I leaned back, my head spinning. "Who is she?" I asked. "Private Eye," Lydia said, her lips twitching. "Best I know. Hates cheats like Ruth." I nodded, grateful but uneasy. How deep did this go? The night stretched on, Lydia working late, her laptop screen glowing blue against her face. I crashed on the couch, the note crumpled in my fist. Sleep a distant hope with every creak of the house sounding like footsteps. Mara showed up at noon, her silver-streaked hair catching the weak sunlight, her leather jacket creaking as she strode in. She was all edges, sharp cheekbones, sharper eyes, a woman who'd seen too much and didn't flinch. "Greedy aunt, huh?" she said, dropping a duffel bag by the door. "Spill it." I told her everything. The funeral, Ruth's gloat, the fake box, the threat. She smirked, a predator's gleam in her gaze. "She's a fool. I'll check her moves. Banks don't mess around with fakes." She left with Lydia's copies of the trust, promising dirt by morning. I watched her go, my hands clammy, then turned to the kitchen, needing something to do. That's when Jake Russo called, an old buddy of Henry's, a gruff land dealer with a voice like gravel. "Heard about your grandpa," he said, his tone warm but cautious. "Ruth's stirring shit, ain't she?" I gripped the phone, surprised. "How'd you know?" Jake chuckled. "She tried selling me fake deeds years back. Henry warned me. You need help, kid. I'm around." I thanked him, a flicker of relief easing my nerves. Henry's allies were still out there. The next day, Mara was back, her boots thudding as she tossed a folder on the table. "Nevada Bank," she said, her voice clipped. "Ruth hit it last week. Thought she scored big. All junk. Fake stocks, forged bonds. She's pissed." Lydia smirked, but I felt a chill. She knows yet? I asked. Mara shrugged. Soon. And this? She slid me a photo, a grainy shot of Ruth with a man, tall and slick, outside a bar. Victor Hensley, your granddad's old partner. She's in bed with him. My stomach dropped and Lydia paled. I worked for him, she whispered. He's ruthless. Loaned Ruth cash she couldn't repay. I stared at the photo, my hands trembling. What's he want? I asked. Mara's eyes darkened. Your land. They're a team. That night the air turned colder, the pines groaning outside. I was alone, Lydia off meeting a source, Mara chasing leads. I sat by the wood stove, its heat barely touching the chill in my bones, when glass shattered upstairs. My heart leapt, and I grabbed Henry's old shotgun from the closet, my hands slick with sweat. Footsteps thudded above, deliberate, heavy. I crept up the stairs, the barrel shaking, my breath shallow. The hallway was dark, but I saw her. Ruth, her blonde hair wild, a crowbar in her hand, prying at Henry's office door. Ruth! I shouted, my voice raw. She spun, her eyes wide, then narrowed. You little shit! She hissed, lunging at me. I dodged, the crowbar slamming into the wall, and aimed the gun. Get out, I said, my voice trembling but hard. She laughed, a jagged sound. It's mine. Victor says so. Headlights flashed outside, Mara's truck, and Ruth bolted, crashing through a window. I ran after, but she was gone, snow swirling in her wake. Morning brought chaos. Mara stormed in, her face grim, her boots leaving muddy streaks on the hardwood as she tossed a folder onto the kitchen table. She's desperate, forged Henry's name on those fakes. Banks onto her, she said, her voice clipped, her silver hair glinting in the weak sunlight filtering through the curtains. Lydia followed close behind, her eyes red and puffy, her hands twisting the hem of her coat. Victor called me last night, she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf caught in the wind. Threatened to kill me if I don't flip. Give him the trust details. My blood boiled, a hot surge that made my fists clench, and I slammed one down on the table, the coffee mugs rattling. We end this, I growled, my voice raw with fury and fear, the weight of Ruth's madness and Victor's shadow pressing down on me. Jake showed up an hour later, his pickup rattling into the driveway, a GPS tracker clutched in his weathered hand. Henry rigged the real box, he said, grinning, his gravelly voice warm with pride. Opened it, it pings me. Ruth's got nothing. I exhaled, a shaky breath that steadied me, a plan forming in my mind. We'd bait them, finish them, turn Henry's trap into their downfall. I stood by the wood stove, its heat licking at my legs, staring at the GPS tracker Jake had left on the counter. It was small, sleek, a blinking red dot that felt like Henry's last gift, his way of reaching through the grave to protect me. Lydia paced behind me, her boots scuffing the floor, her nerves fraying with every step. We can't just wait, she said, her voice tight. Victor's not bluffing. He'll come for me. I turned, meeting her dark eyes, seeing the fear there, the same fear I'd seen when we broke up years ago, when she couldn't handle my quiet life. He won't touch you, I said, my tone hard, a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, but needed to believe. Mara leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp. We leaked the land's value, she said, her voice low and steady. Ruth's broke. Victor's greedy. They'll bite. Jake nodded, chewing on a toothpick. I've got a buyer lined up, fake one. We stage a meet, catch him red-handed. My heart thudded, a mix of dread and thrill coursing through me. This was it, our shot to bury them. The plan moved fast. Mara called a contact at the Denver Post, planting a story. Caldwell heir set to sell $1 million land. Lydia hacked into Ruth's old email, her password still divorce cash 1, a detail that made me smirk despite everything, and sent Victor a forged message from Ruth. Meet me at the old mill, 8 p.m., Ethan's selling. Jake set up the bait, a briefcase of fake deeds locked with the GPS tracker, its signal pinging to his phone. I stood in the kitchen as dusk fell, the sky outside bruising purple, my hands sweaty around Henry's shotgun. You sure about this? I asked Mara, my voice low. She smirked, checking her pistol. I live for this shit. Lydia grabbed my arm, her grip tight. Don't die, okay? She said, her eyes glistening. I nodded, my throat tight, a flicker of something old sparking between us. Trust, maybe, or more. We drove to the mill, an abandoned husk on the edge of town, its rusted silos looming against the night. Snow crunched under our tires, the air biting my face as I stepped out, the briefcase heavy in my hand. Mara took point, her flashlight cutting through the dark, Jake flanking me with a crowbar he'd pulled from his truck. Lydia stayed in the car, her laptop open, tracking the GPS. "They're close," she radioed, her voice crackling in my earpiece. My pulse raced, every shadow a threat, every gust of wind Ruth's laugh. Then I saw her, Ruth, slipping through a broken door, her coat flapping, a wild glint in her eyes. Victor followed, tall and slick in a tailored suit, his face hard, a gun gleaming in his hand. "Where's the deed?" he snapped, his voice cold, cutting through the silence. I held up the briefcase, my hand steady despite the fear clawing my chest. "Right here," I said, my voice loud, baiting them. Ruth lunged, her nails clawing for it, but Victor grabbed her arm. "Not yet," he hissed, aiming at me. "Drop it, kid." My heart stopped, the barrel staring me down, but Mara moved, fast, silent, a shadow slamming into Victor. His gun fired, the shot echoing, and I ducked, the bullet grazing the silo behind me. Ruth screamed, swinging at me, but Jake tackled her, pinning her to the snowy ground. "You bastard!" she shrieked, her voice breaking, her face smeared with dirt and rage. I kicked the gun from Victor's hand as Mara cuffed him, her knee on his back. "Game over," she said, her breath fogging in the cold. Sirens wailed, Lydia had called the cops, and lights flooded the mill, officers swarming in. Ruth thrashed, her screams turning to sobs as they dragged her away, her eyes locking on mine, hollow with defeat. Victor glared, silent, his empire crumbling in the snow. But it wasn't over. 2 days later, Tommy showed up at my door, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Mom's gone nuts in jail," he said, his voice cracking. "She says Victor's got people. Someone's coming for you." My stomach dropped, and I called Mara. She dug deeper, finding Victor's ties to a shady loan shark. Ruth had been a pawn, but the shark was still out there. The bank fraud case hit Ruth hard. 10 years, her account seized, her mansion sold to pay debts. Victor got 20, his threats useless behind bars. I sold the land to Jake, a fair deal, and used the cash to build a school in Henry's name, a brick-and-mortar promise to his memory. Lydia stuck around, her hand brushing mine as we watched the groundbreaking, a quiet peace settling between us. One night, unpacking the last of Henry's things, I found a package, no return address, just a photo of him with a man I didn't know, his face blurred, and a note. "Careful, Ethan. It's not done." My breath caught, a chill creeping up my spine as I stared out the window, the pines swaying in the dark. Ruth rots in a cell now, her dreams dust, her days a gray hell of her own making. Victor's locked away, his power stripped, his threats empty echoes. I'm free, building something good from Henry's legacy, but that note haunts me. Someone's still watching. Henry taught me greed blinds, trust saves, and family's what you fight for. What do you think? Is that shadow real, or just my paranoia? Tell me below. I'm not sure I want to face this alone.